Did anyone else ever get involved in that weird little social experiment called Flat Stanley? I went to elementary school in the late 90s, somewhere between 1995 and 2001. I was in 3rd grade when our teacher announced we'd be part of the Flat Stanley project. If you're unfamiliar, it was based on a series of books about a flat kid who went on bizarre adventures to famous places: New York, the Grand Canyon, France, Australia. He was like a two-dimensional version of Curious George. We started reading the books in class, making them part of our English lessons, and one day, our teacher, Mrs. Garrison, told us we'd be having a contest. Today's English assignment, she said with a big smile, is to create your own Flat Stanley. You can make him look however you want, and the winner of the contest will get 3 prizes from the prize basket. Plus, their Flat Stanley will be the one we send out into the world for the Flat Stanley project. We were all buzzing with excitement. Not only was this a chance to see our creation in the pictures that would come back, but we'd also get some cool stuff from the prize basket. Everyone started drawing and coloring their own version of Flat Stanley. I turned mine into a spy, trench coat, wide-brimmed hat, binoculars. Underneath, he had regular clothes, but he looked so goofy I thought I might actually stand a chance. My buddy, Tyler, chuckled when he saw mine and told me it was awesome. His Flat Stanley was a football player for the Georgia Bulldogs, his favorite team, and I thought his looked pretty cool too. When it came time to vote on the designs, I figured Kayla's, Flat Stephanie, would win. She'd glued on a sparkly tiara and made a ball gown out of felt. It was super fancy, and I even voted for hers since we weren't allowed to vote for our own. If not Kayla's, I thought Matt's would take the prize. His Stanley was a truck driver, complete with a mesh hat and a sleeveless t-shirt. He'd put a ton of effort into it. I knew some kids thought mine was funny, but I didn't expect to win. I didn't use any special materials, so I figured I'd just hang it in my room after the contest. When Mrs. Garrison announced my Flat Stanley had won, I was stunned. I went home that afternoon with 3 prizes, a super bouncy ball, a pocket-sized Stretch Armstrong, and a Pikachu-shaped eraser. I was also bursting to tell my mom about my victory. I explained how my Flat Stanley was going to travel to other schools and places, and we'd get pictures back showing all the cool places he'd been. Mom thought it was awesome, and we started dreaming up where he might end up. Paris? Disney World? The moon? We laughed about that last one. Dad joined in when he got home, and we spent the evening imagining Stanley's grand adventures. That night, I fell asleep wondering about all the exciting places my Flat Stanley might visit. At first, everything was pretty normal. Mrs. Garrison sent Stanley to a school in the next town over, and a week later, we got pictures back. Stanley had gone to a volleyball game, an art museum, and a class play. Then he traveled to another school, where he went hiking, visited the zoo, and attended a baseball game. It wasn't the Atlanta Braves, just a t-ball game, but still, it was neat. Over the next few months, Stanley journeyed to Texas, New Mexico, California, Idaho, and Kansas. We hung up the pictures, sent thank you cards, and talked about the places he'd been. Stanley became part of everything that year: geography, math, English. In geography, we'd figure out where he was based on clues. In math, we calculated how far he'd traveled. It was like Stanley had taken over the whole curriculum. But then, one Wednesday in April, things changed. Mrs. Garrison wasn't in class. We were all disappointed because Wednesdays were Flat Stanley Day, when we got letters and pictures. The substitute teacher said Mrs. Garrison would explain when she returned. That day, there was no Flat Stanley update. When Mrs. Garrison came back the following week, she didn't mention Stanley. All the Flat Stanley stuff was gone, as if it had never existed. We moved on to other lessons, but the mystery of Stanley lingered. Kids whispered about it all the way into 4th grade, but no one ever got an explanation. The whole thing stayed a mystery, until I decided to become a teacher myself. Now I'm in my 2nd year of college, working through student teaching. I've always wanted to teach elementary school, maybe 4th or 5th grade. When I got assigned a mentor teacher, I couldn't believe it. It was Mrs. Garrison. She teaches 5th grade now, nearing retirement, but she recognized me instantly. She gave me a big hug and said, "Welcome back. I'm so glad to see you've chosen teaching." Mrs. Garrison's classroom was in the same room where I had been her student all those years ago. The kids reminded me of my friends and me back in 3rd grade. She had a great group, curious, eager to learn, and clearly fond of her. Mrs. Garrison had this natural ability to hold their attention, and I hoped I could pick up some of her tricks. The kids warmed up to me quickly, and before long, I was leading lessons while Mrs. Garrison sat back and observed. Being back in her class brought back a flood of memories from when I was her student, especially the Flat Stanley project. Of course, her 5th graders were too old for something like that, they'd think it was babyish, but thinking about Stanley stirred up that old mystery I'd never solved. I wanted to ask her about it, but no moment seemed right. Until the 2nd Friday. I was packing up to leave and Mrs. Garrison asked if I wanted to join her for drinks. Her offer caught me off guard, and she must have noticed because she laughed at my surprised expression. "What?" she teased, draping her coat over her arm. "You didn't know teachers drink?" I decided to go, and when we arrived, I saw a small group of other teachers already there. Some I recognized, most I didn't, but it turned out this was their usual end-of-week routine. They chatted, vented about tough students, and swapped stories to blow off steam. Mrs. Garrison and I found a spot in the corner, mostly listening and sipping our drinks. She smiled at me over the rim of her 4th glass of wine around 11 o'clock. "I've been sending glowing reviews to your professors," she said, leaning in conspiratorially. "You're one of the best student teachers I've worked with. I'd bet money you'll get hired at the end of your training period. If the principal doesn't offer you a position, I'll recommend you myself." I was flattered and thanked her, nursing my 2nd beer while I let her words sink in. "Can I ask you something?" I said, the question forming before I could stop myself. She raised an eyebrow. "Neither of us is drunk enough for you to offer me a ride home, big guy," she joked, snorting into her glass. No, nothing like that," I said quickly. "It's about something from when I was in your class. Do you remember the Flat Stanley project we did?" Her smile faltered, and I thought I saw her shiver slightly. "I'm surprised you remember that," she said slowly. "It was so long ago." "Well, everything just disappeared so suddenly," I said. "One day it was all gone, the books, the letters, even the pictures. When you came back, you never mentioned it again. We talked about it for months after, but then we moved on." She stared off into the distance for a moment, as though weighing whether she wanted to tell me or not. "I think I need some air. Would you walk with me?" I nodded, and we left the table amid a chorus of teasing comments from the other teachers, something about cougars and cradle robbing. She looped her arm through mine, pretending not to hear, but I could feel the tension in her grip as we stepped onto the patio. The cool night air did little to loosen her stiffness. She leaned on the railing, gazing at the waves below as they crashed against the rocks. I stood beside her, waiting patiently as she tried to find the right words. "Are you sure you want to know?" she finally asked, her voice quiet. "It's a pretty messed up story. But maybe it'll be a good lesson for you, help you avoid making the kind of mistake that got me in a lot of trouble. They canceled the Flat Stanley project for the whole school because of it." I told her I did want to know, intrigued by what could have gone so wrong with something as innocent as a kid's art project. "Well," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "you remember how we sent Stanley to a school in the next town over, right? And then they sent him to another school, and so on. Our class got back more material than most, probably double what other classes did. I was thrilled. Stanley became such a big part of the curriculum, and the kids loved it. It was one of the most successful projects I'd ever run." She paused, taking a deep breath. "Then one day, I came to school and found a package waiting for me. It had arrived the day before." She shivered again, folding her arms as if to shield herself from the memory. I was excited. I thought maybe it was another batch of photos or letters. We were starting fractions that day, and I hoped I could tie the package into the lesson somehow. I got my wish, but not in the way I'd hoped. I reached into my pocket for a cigarette. Mrs. Garrison noticed and asked if she could have one. I stared at Mrs. Gazel, unable to process what she had just told me. Her words hung in the salty air around us, mixing with the crash of waves and the faint hum of the bar behind us. It felt like the world had stopped spinning for a moment, her vivid descriptions of the horrors committed by that monster etching themselves into my brain. Did they ever? My voice wavered, but I had to ask. Did they ever figure out how he got it? How he got Flat Stanley? She nodded, though the motion was slight. They think it was intercepted at the post office. A mistake, someone lazy with the mail, and it ended up in his hands. But they never confirmed it. No one ever took responsibility. And maybe no one ever wanted to admit they were a part of it. She finished her cigarette, the cherry glowing dimly in the dark, and dropped it to the ground, snuffing it out with the heel of her shoe. The police said we were lucky, that he didn't fixate on the school. But I've always wondered, she hesitated, glancing over at me, her voice trembling. What if he did? What if he was watching us, watching you kids, and decided we weren't the right targets? Or, what if we were too close, and that's why he stopped? The thought chilled me to my core. I walked her to her car in silence, my mind reeling. She thanked me with a weary smile, and I watched her drive away, the taillights disappearing into the distance. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying her story over and over. The thought of Flat Stanley at the center of something so horrific was surreal, like a childhood memory twisted into a nightmare. The years passed, and as Mrs. Gazel predicted, I became a teacher. Her story stayed with me, a cautionary tale I never shared with anyone, until recently. Last month, a package arrived at my school. The secretary handed it to me with a curious smile, saying it had no return address. It was flat and lightweight, the size of a standard envelope. My heart sank as I stared at it. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, and I felt a strange, familiar dread creep up my spine. I took it to my desk, locked the door, and opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph, aged and slightly crinkled. In the picture stood Flat Stanley, my Flat Stanley, propped against the bloodied torso of a woman I didn't recognize. Her eyes were wide open, her expression frozen in terror, and my name was scrawled across her chest in crimson ink. My stomach churned as I flipped the photo over. On the back, written in bold, jagged letters, were the words. "Did you miss me?" My hands trembled, and I dropped the photograph as if it were burning. I looked back at the envelope, noticing something I hadn't seen before. There was another line written in faint pencil, almost an afterthought. "He's been busy. The authorities are investigating now, but they're not hopeful. Whoever sent the package knows how to cover their tracks." It's been weeks since I received it, and the fear hasn't left me. Every time I see a child coloring or cutting paper, I feel sick to my stomach. Every time I pass the bulletin board in my classroom, I flinch, expecting to see another picture pinned there by unseen hands. I tried to tell myself it's a prank, someone messing with me. But deep down, I know the truth. Flat Stanley isn't just a project anymore. He's a message. And somewhere out there, someone is still answering.